بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين حمدا يوافي نعمه يكافي مزيدا يا ربنا لك الحمد كما ينبغي لجلال وجهك ولعظيم سلطانك سبحانك لا نحصي ثناء عليك أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك فلك الحمد حتى ترضى ولك الحمد إذا رضيت ولك الحمد بعد الرضا اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في الأولين وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في الآخرين وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في كل وقت وحين وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في الملأ الأعلى إلى يوم الدين وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد حتى ترث الأرض ومن عليها أنت خير وارثين نويت تعلم وتعليم وتذكر وتذكير ونفع انتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على تمسك بكتاب الله وبسنة رسوله سبحانه وتعالى. قال الشيخ عبدالله سراج الحسين رحمه الله تعالى في كتاب سيدنا محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم شمائله الحميدة وخصاله المجيدة في باب جوامع من أوصافه الكريمة المشتملة على محاسن خلقه وكمال خلقه وأدابه الخاصة والعامة. إن من أجمع الأحاديث الواردة في بيان أوصاف النبي صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم الخلقية والخلقية وما يتعلق بآدابه الخاصة والعامة. ومن أوضح تلك الأحاديث المعربة عن شمائله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم حديث هند بن أبي هالة رواه الترمذي عن حسن بن علي رضي الله تعالى عنهما أنه قال: سألت خالي هند بن أبي هالة وكان وصافا عن حلية رسول الله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم وأنا أشتهي أن يصف لي منها شيئا أتعلق به. طيب, at the chapter here that the Imam rahimahullah ta'ala entitles the hadith of Hind ibn Abi Hala rahimahullah ta'ala. As we're aware, saying Hind ibn Abi Hala is of the most beloved people to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam by virtue of the fact that he's from of the most beloved people to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, who sent to Khadija bint Khuwaylid radiyallahu ta'ala anha wa ardaha. And this is the son of Sayyidina Khadija, yani to Abi Hala, and thereby considered the Rabiba, or the stepson of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi and thereby to be considered of the great companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who stood alongside the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in all of the mashahid, in all of the military campaigns of Nabuwa radiyallahu ta'ala anhu wardahu. And so he is the wasaf, as is testified to by Sayyidina Hassan in the tradition we look at, but likewise also by Sayyidina Hussein radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma, Sibtay Rasulillahi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Rayhata, the two fragrant ones of paradise, and the Sayyids of paradise, of all youth in paradise. Comprehensive in expressing his sallallahu alaihi wasallam's unique qualities, and that is the hadith anhu. He said, I asked my uncle Hind ibn Abi Hala, his maternal uncle, he called him Khalati, and Khali, who was gifted at describing about the beauty of the Prophet. We mentioned Sayyidina Hassan and Hussein radiallahu anhum wardahum, in their desire to increase the knowledge of the Prophet ﷺ, as expressed herein, in order to connect to the Prophet ﷺ, i.e. to love the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. They both used to compete with one another in order to get to Sayyidina Hind radiallahu ta'ala anhu wardah, and to bring out of him some of the peculiarities of the Prophet ﷺ, khalqam, in terms of his physical التعلق به يعني به يعني بالنبي, by virtue of which they can be تعلق بالنبي Allah يعني برسول الله بحبيب الله صلى الله عليه وصحبه وسلم. But تعلق here is love, يعني it's love and attachment. And that no doubt the purpose, inshallah ta'ala, one of the great purposes of studying the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because study knowledge, but as we mentioned previously, the actual aim and objective is love of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Here we see explicitly, mashallah ta'ala, expressed by the beautiful one, Sayyidina Hassan, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, wa an abihi. He replied, saying to him that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had great and stately attributes, and he was honored as such by others, sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, and his face shined and the parallel is born between the full moon and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, and there's multiple quote unquote any parallels in that regard. But amongst them is the light. We know the light of the full moon, like it literally illuminates darkness. I mean, the light of the sun, it eliminates darkness. But the light of the moon, it illuminates darkness. And that's part of the parallel they want from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa sallam. Also perfection. And the full moon also in its perfection, and the Badr, yani that's also like an allusion to the perfection of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For Luqat al-Arab, it's also used for beauty and splendor, like Layla kal-Badri, of the quote unquote of the first lessons you learn in the science of rhetoric, the science of Balagha, that Layla is like the full moon. Layla Badrun, Layla is the full moon. And by that they mean like beauty and in the splendor of Layla. And likewise with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wasallam. And it's also no, it was like the full moon. And I mean here in the shape of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wa sallam's face. Yani of all of quote the orbits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, none, quote unquote, even the sun, none has been compared more to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam than the full moon. And some of them say that's representative of the name of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Taha, that the name of the Rasul, Taha, that name that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the tradition in the Musnad of Ahmad bin Hanbal was calling out 1,000 years before he even created creation. And sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, that there the numerology is 14, and the Taha, and the Ta 9, Ha 5, and 14. And so that's one of the reasons that the full moon is symbolic of the reality of Taha, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. And so his face shined or shone like the night of the full moon, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. And he was taller than a man of average height, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, but shorter than a tall man. And again, the context is the age of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sahbihi wa sallam, where you had people, quote unquote, who approximated like 3 foot off the ground. Seduce the men of 6, yani, the men of 6 what cubits, 6 yani arms length, radiallahu anhu, which many of the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam yani had such a height. Okay, but the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is considered a man of average height in the context of his people, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, or more so as clarified, atwal min al-marbu', and taller than average, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The Rasul in excess of 6'3" in height, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And his head was large, but remember proportional to the largeness of the body of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. In every regard, when we look at the of the Prophet ﷺ. In every regard, the Prophet ﷺ was large, but that largeness was proportional. Okay, so none of it seemed out of place with the Prophet ﷺ, neither was it out of place. And his head was large and his hair was wavy, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and that's wavy after the Prophet has groomed his hair, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Wa illa, otherwise the Prophet ﷺ has curly hair, as in a hadith in Tirmidhi of Sayyidina Ali karamallahu wajhu, that ja'adan curly. Sayyidina Ali karamallahu wajhu says, and then when the Prophet grooms his hair, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, then it becomes wavy. Sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. If it parted easily, he would part it in the center. If not, he would not. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, yukhalif qawma, and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he contradicts his people. In that when the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is inside of Mecca al-Mukarramah, in Quraysh, ordinarily they hold a center part inside of their hair. So they have long hair. Quraysh, the men of the day, they had long hair. And that no doubt the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. And to the point of some of the Imams, especially the Imams of the Malikiyah, they place it beyond the sunnah. They can consider min al-wajibat lil-rijal, as wajib for the men to have hair like the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and not touch their hair, whatsoever. That's a position of the Imam Qad'iyat rahimahullah ta'ala. For example, in the likes of Imam Jazuli, rahimahullah ta'ala, Imam Jazuli considers it to be a point that if somebody cuts their hair and thinks that it's somewhat religious and good, that it's wajib upon the Imam to declare war upon that person. The great Imam Abdallah al-Khairat al-Jazuli, rahimahullah ta'ala. And so the Prophet ﷺ in Mecca al-Mukarramah, in the Quraysh, used to wear long hair to the shoulder length, but they used to part, they have a center part. The Prophet ﷺ upon the edict, Khalif al-Mushrikeen, and contradict the Mushrikeen, that the Prophet ﷺ would not part his hair, ﷺ, seemingly. And then likewise also when the Prophet now migrates to Medina to Munawwara, in that the Jews didn't used to part their hair. And likewise, they also had long hair, shoulder length hair. The Prophet ﷺ now announces, ﷺ, Khalif al-Yahud, and they did to the Yahud. And so the Prophet ﷺ now paused. And we mentioned, the Imam mentioned the meaning of ease. And with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's where the divine hand is found. I quote unquote into the vision that when the Rasul's hair begins to part seemingly naturally, but it's the divine hand, subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is parting the hair of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Rasul goes with that flow. Okay, and that's going to be the reality of Medina. But if the divine hand does not part the hair of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then the Rasul goes with that flow, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that's in Mecca al-Mukarramah, where you don't see any part, center part inside of the hair, the blessed hair of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His hair would fall beyond his earlobes if he left it be. And as we said, that's the entire life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It falls way beyond the earlobes of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, yadribi mankibay, until it bounces off his shoulders, sallallahu alaihi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. As they mentioned, only 4 celebration, those days of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And his complexion was fair, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, yani fair in the context of his people and the people of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Of the neocortex of the Prophet ﷺ, or the frontal lobal system of the Prophet ﷺ, that is incomparably bigger in terms of what it contains, knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and knowledge of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, than the collective minds of all humanity for all eternity, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. And his eyebrows were long and arched, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and full, without connecting, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. although one could be forgiven for believing that the eyebrows of the Prophet ﷺ are connected. Between them was a vein with thumb. And it became angry, ﷺ, and it becomes one of the signs that the companions know that the Rasul ﷺ is angry, and that's min rahmatullah, and that's from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them such a sign, because the anger of the Prophet ﷺ is but the anger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as in Sahih Bukhari, ma kana yaghdab li lahu nurun ya'lu, Sayyidina says, lahu nurun ya'lu. Lahu, the Imam is different. What is the pronoun here? Lahu. Does that pronoun return to the nose of the Prophet ﷺ, or does it return to the Prophet ﷺ himself? Does he have light above his nose ﷺ, or is it light above his head sallallahu alayhi wa sallam? Imams affirm in both. And so there was light above it, and those who not pay close attention might think that his nose upturned. And he says, due to the fact that the light, quote unquote, is skewing the actual vision of the actual shape, aquiline shape of the nose of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His beard was thick, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and his cheeks were ta'ala, and his teeth were well spaced, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. What that sort of means is no doubt there's a type of equilibrium between the feet of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. When we look at space, well spaced, the Imams rahimahullah ta'ala don't want that to be misunderstood, because some misunderstood it, believing that the spaces between all of the teeth of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. That's not the case. It's only here that Rasul has a space, one space between his two upper teeth, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. So to say in Hind, in the other riwayah, he said, yakhruj kanur, from which something like light would emanate from between these two teeth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Saying Hind radiallahu anhu, yani wa ardahu, says, our teachers say like light. I mean, even this sort of physical light that quote unquote that we quote unquote sense, it's an injustice to compare that to the light of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, like light. A thin line of hair ran from his chest to his navel, and that's the masruba, masruba. And it's the only prominent quote unquote hair upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Wa'illa, I say in the Hind and others, they say the Rasul, when you look at him, ajrad would mean he's like he's stripped of all bodily hair. What they mean, any prominent bodily hair, will accept the actual masruba, and that's the thin line of hair that ran from his chest to his navel, although this slight hair, if you look carefully, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, that was perfect in nature. Badin mutamasik is the exact term that Sayyidina Hind used. He's badin, which he translates